Our third panelist, Dr. Wexler, was called to the White House for a meeting this afternoon. He sends his apologies. He's really sorry he can't be here. But we have two really interesting people who I know will pique your interest in their presentations and their themes. And we'll have, you'll probably be happy to have more extra time with them to talk about their two subjects. Bud Cole from the National Defense University is going to be talking about security, military security, strategic threats in the international scene, or challenges to the United States in the security area. And Ed Gresser is going to be talking about the international economic challenges that the United States faces. You have read their bios, so I'm not going to go into that now. I just want you to know that I know both of them. Ed has spoken here before several years ago. Bud hasn't, but I've heard him on other occasions, and you're in for a treat with both of them. We're going to start first with the security issues. They'll each talk about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from all of you. So, Bud, it's all yours. You can stand up here or sit there, whatever you want to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Honored to be here today. Since I'm an employee of the United States government, I have to give a disclaimer, and that is that I speak only for myself and not for the U.S. government. An even better disclaimer that I've started giving recently when I give public talks, which may seem a little ironic to you, is when I try to give my views on China or the U.S.-Chinese relations, I always start off by saying that I'm not Chinese, okay? So my views are very much my own. In terms of U.S. international security concerns, let me note first something that happened in 1660 when John Winthrop, one of the early settlers to North America from England, was on a ship coming across the Atlantic Ocean, and he wrote that he wanted to establish a city upon a hill. In other words, he wanted this new country that he was going to settle to serve as a beacon to all the peoples of the world, as a symbol of individual freedom and progress. And I think if we looked at the speeches of every American president, from George Washington through Barack Obama, we could find speeches where the president said those sorts of words in explaining why the United States was adopting certain foreign policies or taking certain national security actions. In fact, if we look back at John Quincy Adams in the early 19th century, or Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century, we could find instances where these presidents, observing very large-scale humanitarian abuses overseas, said it is not the United States' job to go correct those abuses. It is merely the United States' position to serve as a model for how things should be in the world. That pattern was changed later in the 20th century, primarily during the World Wars, and then really changed dramatically with the onset of the Cold War, where in 1945 the United States emerged from the world's greatest, most devastating war as the strongest nation in the world, without question, without comparison. Later, of course, the Soviet Union developed its own nuclear weapons and emerged as a competitor. And that competition defined the Cold War in bipolar terms. When the Cold War ended in 1990, when the Soviet Union failed as a nation state, if you will, certainly failed as an ideological model, the United States found itself in a very different situation because we had whole generations of policymakers who had grown up during the World War II and during the Cold War. And this was the strategic world that dominated here in Washington and really throughout the United States. Since the end of the Cold War, of course, we faced a much different world. We've now faced a world that is much more characterized, the threats in which are much more characterized by transnational problems. And these are all familiar to you. Illegal immigration, global warming, disease, cyber, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, failing states, many problems like this that concern all the established nations of the world. The United States view, I think it's safe to say, in looking at this confusing situation, is to try to follow or to establish or reach goals of stability and security worldwide. And I'll talk more in a minute about the United States' ability to do that. One of the biggest problems facing the United States today, in terms even of international security situations, was really very nicely verbalized by our previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullins, when he said the United States' largest, most important, most dangerous national security threat was its own domestic economy. And I think I subscribe to that view, that the United States' domestic economy is the key to resolving various national and even international situations. The current U.S. international position, I think, is based primarily on alliances and on a multilateral approach, whether it be through the United Nations or to attempt to have APEC or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations act in a group. These define the U.S. desire to adopt a multilateral approach. One of the reasons for that is the problem that was addressed by Admiral Mullen, that is the U.S. domestic economy right now. Now, following the downturn of 2008 has certainly been serious, and we continue to see the effects of that. But I think it's too easy to exaggerate that economic downturn in the United States, certainly on an international basis, where we observe that the United States is still by a significant margin the world's largest economy and arguably the largest economic presence in East Asia as well as around the world. Nonetheless, this remains a problem that the United States has to solve when we look at global or international security. The key, I think, today, apart from economic considerations, or tied really to economic considerations when the United States looks at various areas of the world as an international participant, is one of access. Political access, economic access, whether we describe this as the open door, to use an old phrase, or freedom of navigation through the seas. The United States is always going to insist, I think, on access to the various areas of the world. As far as particular concerns emerge, I think in Western Europe we see increasing concern about the viability of the European Union, particularly when we look at the southern tier states of Cyprus and Greece and Spain and Italy and Portugal. This is not just the United States concern, of course, but really a concern to the entire global economy. In both Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, we see areas where relatively new nation states in many cases are struggling to become viable 21st century economies and to ensure their political stability. The Middle East, of course, remains a huge problem in terms of the populations emerging into the 21st century and seeking some economic modernity and political stability. And for the United States, of course, there's a special case in the Middle East, which is the State of Israel, which remains very much, in the U.S. view, a vital national security concern of the United States. In East Asia, obviously China is the rising power. The United States and China face one area of contention, I think, and this is not my idea. I took this from former Ambassador Stapleton Roy. If we look at what we have seen many writings from the People's Liberation Army talk about, the three C's, the Jinhai or the Sanhai, the near seas or the three C's, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, being a vital national security concern to Beijing. This is also the geographic area where the United States has mutual defense treaties with the Republic of South Korea, with Japan, and with the Philippines. We also, of course, have treaties with Australia. This is an area of potential contention, and it's the one area in East Asia, I think, where Washington and Beijing have to make their strongest effort to ensure that differences can be resolved peacefully and diplomatically. Let me close with well, before I issue my closing statement, let me also describe the Korean situation, or refer to the Korean situation, where we have North Korea apparently not willing to follow any sort of rational international model. Frankly, Beijing doesn't seem to have a whole lot more influence in Pyongyang than Washington does. Nonetheless, I don't think this is an existential problem either to China or the United States or our allies, but it is a problem that both nations are going to have to continue to deal with. The larger issue, I would say in my closing statement is, I mentioned that since World War II, the United States has been the global power, certainly since 1990, the world superpower. If we look at the economic readjustments that are taking place in the United States, the tendency to getting away from trying a military solution to every problem, something we've certainly seen, I think, during the President Obama administration. The question has to arise, a question I posed to my students in seminar just the other day. Should the United States, can the United States continue to be the dominant, the hegemon, if you will, of the world? Is it up to the United States, is it within the United States' capability to seek out and try to ameliorate, to try to correct any human rights abuse situation or any situation in which we have a failing state that threatens its neighbors? Let me just leave you with that thought, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I have a couple of notes I'm going to speak from here, if that's all right. Dr. Cole mentioned in his view and in the view of the former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, Admiral Mullen, the U.S. domestic economy is the biggest threat or the biggest concern for security thinking. I'm not sure I entirely concur with that, but let me start with the U.S. domestic economy in a little bit of a descriptive way, then talk about the international side of policy, in one sense in a short to medium term set of interests, and then in a longer term set of interests, and then a little bit about how China fits in. American economy is about $16 trillion this year. That is 21% of the world GDP. We have 114 million private sector workers. They're employed at 6 million businesses, 1.5 million nonprofits, and about 3 million farms. The economy has been, since the financial crisis, characterized by relatively slow growth and quite high unemployment by historical standards. There are reasons for this, which I'll get into in a moment. But in terms of some longer-term characteristics of the U.S., on the more negative side, we have a quite low national savings rate. Americans are the world's shoppers. We're always going out to restaurants and malls and auto shops and whatnot. The growth, therefore, in the U.S. is usually driven by consumption, people going out and buying things. The offsetting factor, where we are a little bit different from Asian countries in particular, is that we have a very high rate of home ownership. Most Americans, rather than putting their money into the bank, try to raise family wealth by buying a house and hoping the value grows as the years passed. This has helped American families build assets and made us a fairly affluent country. In the last decade, it got badly out of control. A lot of people bought houses who couldn't afford them, and then we had a consequence in lots of bad loans and bankruptcies and a national economic crisis. Apart from this characteristic of the domestic economy, we also have a lower rate of exporting than most countries. U.S. export as a share of GDP is about 14%. This is not quite the lowest among the major economies. It's a little bit above Brazil, and a little bit below Japan, but it's well below the figures you'd see for China or for European countries. On the more positive side, a couple of points to mention. We have a very innovative economy that is characterized by a number of really excellent sectors. We have, in general, a high rate of research and development at 2.9% of GDP. And we have geographically and nationally places like Hollywood, like Silicon Valley, like Wall Street, like Ivy League, like the pharmaceutical and aircraft and software industries, which are really very, very high quality and often unmatched in the world. Also positive, we've had an unexpected bit of good luck in energy. There's been a lot of innovation in the energy business in the last 4 or 5 years, and the result has been a lot of finds of previously unattainable natural gas and some oil as well. This may, according to whom you believe and listen to, make the U.S. More or less independent in energy within the next 10 years. And in contrast to countries in Western Europe and East Asia, the U.S. is demographically relatively young. We have a higher rate of childbirth and more immigration, so we are not liable to run into the labor shortages that are already evident in Japan and Korea, likely to affect China in the next decades. What does all this say for policy? In the immediate future, for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, the U.S. is continuing to suffer from the after effects of the financial crisis. Families having built up a lot of wealth in homes lost a huge amount of money in 2009. According to the Federal Reserve Bank, families had about $13.5 trillion in home equity, in wealth embodied in their homes in 2007. And they now have about $7.5 trillion or $8 trillion. So there's been a gigantic loss of wealth, almost as much as the entire Chinese GDP, not quite as much, but close. That is rebuilding slowly over time, but it has made Americans very cautious. They are not buying new homes, they're not buying cars, they're not in the restaurants and malls as much as they used to be. And for that reason, our growth is fairly slow and businesses are not hiring very much. The administration, and I think also Congress and the business community, view the solution to this in the next several years as becoming more export intensive, of making more things and producing more things for foreign markets. That has been happening over the last few years. There's been quite a large increase in exports, and the administration has hopes that exports will double within the next couple of years and has a number of trade initiatives that are meant to boost this. They're trying to increase export promotion. They have an Asia and Latin America, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which involves Canada and Mexico and Japan, as well as some smaller countries. On the other side of the country, we have an initiative which isn't quite clear yet, but meant to be a sort of free trade agreement with the European Union. And so they are, you'll notice that there's a powerful and important country that's not on either of these lists, and perhaps we can talk about that during the questions and answer session. Over the longer term, assuming that the domestic economy does revive in the next few years, and the signs of it are pretty good, growth is accelerating a bit and unemployment is drifting slowly down. Longer term, I think, central interest of the United States is to maintain its success as an innovative economy. That, I think, is the comparative advantage of the United States. When you think about the areas where we're very successful in these fields like aircraft and pharmaceuticals and software and in movies and internet industries, it depends on the ability to take advantage of investment in research and creation of new products. This makes intellectual property and cyber issues a high priority in American policy, and I think that will continue to be a fact about American economic diplomacy for quite a long time to come. It also has implications for education and immigration. One of the lucky things about the U.S. is we've been able to attract quite a lot of talented people from abroad. These are often students such as yourselves who come out, who stay in the U.S. and set up companies or go to work at high-tech firms. And so in tandem with the intellectual property dimension of American policy, there's, I think, going to always be a lot of attention to high-skilled immigration and how do we make the U.S. continue to be an attractive place for people to come and live. Where then does China come into all of this? On the trading and export side, China is the world's fastest growing major economy. It is a fast growing export market for Americans, and I think is now the largest market or or very close with Canada as a buyer of farm products and agricultural goods. It is also the country where we have some of our most significant challenges with intellectual property and counterfeiting and those sorts of products, all sorts of topics. China is also a very large source of immigrants to the United States. And as you have probably seen in newspapers today, it is probably or is likely to be one of the significant sources of foreign investment in the U.S. over the next decade. So in all of these areas, U.S. government will have quite difficult choices to make in China policy. It has a lot of frustrations with Chinese policy. It also views China in a lot of ways as an area of great promise. And perhaps I will leave it there and open it up to your questions. Thank you all very much.
Okay. Questions? Start right here.
Okay, thanks. My question is about energy and air pollution in China. So as we all know, there is some problem in China for air pollution. And the main reason of air pollution in China is because of the coal fuel usage. For the near future, natural gas has been considered as a very promising clean energy, and the U.S. has invested a lot of money on this field. So my question is, do you think U.S. can export the technology involved with natural gas, for example, water cracking or something, to China to help China get more natural gas, very clean energy, to help China improve air pollution? Thanks.
Tell us who you are and where you're from.
Oh, I'm Yang Liu, and I'm from Duke University.
Studying?
Studying in biomedical.
Biomedical. Okay. Ed, do you want to take that? Start.
I guess I should echo Dr. Cole in saying, especially not as I'm not a government official anymore, I have only my own opinion. Mining equipment and energy equipment are big exports for the United States worldwide. I think that the people who make those things will be quite enthusiastic about selling to China. The U.S. is going through, actually right now, a debate about whether to export natural gas itself. We have not been exporting energy for many, many years. We now have quite a big supply of natural gas, and I think it will not be long before the U.S. is exporting a lot of actual liquefied natural gas to Asia, and probably to China as well.
Do you, can I just, well, go ahead, Bud, and then I'll ask.
I was just going to say that China is blessed with the world's third largest coal reserves, and it's not so much the fact that coal creates pollution as the ineffective way that China cleans and ships its coal. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a joint U.S.-China venture to liquefy coal at the mine mouth, which meant that you now had a liquid fuel that burned much less, but caused much less pollution, was a lot easier and less expensive to ship. And those, I think there were 3 prototypes coal liquefaction plants set up. And about 2004, Beijing ordered them shut down because it's a very water-intensive process. And the water in northeast China was actually more valuable than the coal.
That leads into the question I was going to ask you about just the fracking process here. Do you think there's going to be enough environmental outcry about the issues that fracking causes, our own concern about water and having enough supply that might inhibit some of the rise of our use of at least the process that we have now of getting that gas, natural gas?
That's a really good question, and I'm interested to hear Dr. Cole's view. My guess is, up to now, my impression is that fracking is called short for hydraulic fracturing, pumping a lot of heated water down to break up rocks and release gas. The public's reaction to it, I think, has been, you could say, they're very enthusiastic about it as long as it takes place far away from them personally. I think there are not enough people who are near these fracking wells to stop it from happening. They may want to move away, but I think it will continue to happen. unless there is some really horrible disaster. We have had several of those in the past. There was a really bad one in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago where we had a well spouting oil for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that led to a lot of outcry, but to my knowledge, it didn't change American policy about offshore drilling at all, except to try to be more strict with safety requirements. My guess is the same thing will happen with fracking, that this will become a big source of energy for the U.S.
I think I just mentioned two other potential resources for China. One, of course, is shale oil, which China is blessed with. It's a matter of figuring out the most efficient and effective way to recover the fuel from that. It's a complicated process. The other is a possibility of methyl hydrates offshore, the theory being that every seabed oil field has beneath it another layer of this methyl hydrate, which theoretically can be recovered and used as a fuel. Japan, Russia, China, and the United States, and I think some others, have all been experimenting with recovering this. So far, nobody's come up with a really economically efficient way of doing it, but the potential is huge.
You ask question. Hands down if you've asked a question today. Up there, Nick.
In 1990s will cause a tendency to professionalism in the PLA. Do you think the PLA's influence on security and foreign policy is increasing or decreasing, and how it may influence the Sino-US relations? Thank you.
That's a question that's widely debated among U.S. PLA watchers. One fact, of course, is that what we call the first two generations of leadership in China, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, were both revolutionary soldiers. They had impeccable military conditions. If they gave the PLA orders, I doubt there was any questions asked. But now that we've had Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping, with relatively little, if any, military experience, really much more CCP experience in PLA, one, I think, would be safe to say that a different relationship is being established between the military and civilian leadership in China. But that does not mean, I have to emphasize two things. First of all, it does not mean that simply because a leader is wearing a uniform, he is going to be more hard-edged than his civilian counterpart. And as the late Ellis Jaffe, who was one of the very first Western experts on the PLA, in fact, grew up in Shanghai, as Ellis Jaffe used to say, there's no reason in the world why a military officer can't be both ideologically reliable and very professionally competent. So when we speak about professionalization of the PLA, I think we have to be careful to define our terms. Unfortunately, when an American, in my experience, when an American talks to a PLA officer about becoming more professional, it's interpreted as an attack on his ideological credentials. And I think that's an unfortunate interpretation.
Again, hands down if you have not asked a question. Nick, right back there.
Thanks. I'm Jenny or Peng Jing from Johns Hopkins DC campus. I am majoring in finance, and I have a question for Dr. Cole as well. Well, as your speech just now, at the end of your speech, you mentioned the question that should America still be the world's leading power in the next few decades? This is the question I want to know, but I also have a similar question like that, is that do you think America could still be the leading power of the world? Do you think the rise of China would become kind of threat or challenge for U.S. to of its influence on the world? Thanks a lot.
Well, I think that the U.S., the idea of leadership should not mean that the U.S. is the sole actor in a given international situation. That's why I mentioned the importance of multilateralism and world organizations. There's no reason why the U.S. cannot be a leader in a joint effort with China, for instance, concerning North Korea, or why the United States cannot play a significant role in deliberations of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or perhaps even the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the European Union. Instances where the United States could provide leadership as well as perhaps some logistical support and yet not be the sole player in a given situation. But I really think that that's an interesting future that we're going to have to wait and see. If I might go back to the previous gentleman's question very briefly, he asked about the civilian-military relationship in China affecting decision-making in national security affairs in Beijing and also affecting Chinese-American relations. I think that in Beijing, and this is purely supposition on my part, that probably the opinions of the military leaders in Beijing with Xi Jinping have more impact than they might have done with, say, Deng Xiaoping. As far as affecting relations with the United States, I don't think that's the case. I frankly think that the military-to-military relations have long been one of the more reliable aspects of that relationship. During periods when the military-to-military relationship has been suspended by China, for instance, because of perhaps sales of military equipment by the United States to Taiwan, I have on numerous occasions had my PLA counterparts say, we wish we could conduct this visit, but I'm getting political direction not to. So I think the military-to-military relationship is surprisingly stable.
Surprisingly stable at the professional-to-professional
Yes,
basis
at the
when
working
politics
level.
does not get in the way.
Yes.
Okay. Back there? All the way back.
Good afternoon. My name is Chen Jacobson. I just graduated with a master's degree focusing on U.S. taxation from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. My question is for Mr. Gresser. I saw on your resume that you once served as the chief advisor, policy advisor for USTR, and actually that was one of our site visits yesterday. And Ms. Audrey Winter there gave us a wonderful presentation about USTR's amazing, challenging work and her role in her negotiations with China. I also see on your resume that you played a major role in the China WTO accession negotiations with China when you served at your position at USTR. I would like you to further briefly talk a little bit about your work there and what was the most challenging part in your negotiations with China and the WTO.
That's a very interesting question. I don't want to claim very much credit, and that was a negotiation directed by my boss, and we had very professional negotiators in the China office who did the work, and President Clinton had to oversee the whole thing. At that time, my role really was, as you say, as a policy advisor and research aide, and I did most of the drafting of speeches and testimony for the agency. I could take personal credit for one line in the agreement, which is we had gotten to the point of negotiating over hotels and investment in tourism, and the Chinese negotiators said that they wanted to accept investment in high standard hotels, but not in low or medium standard hotels. And our side didn't really know what that meant because those aren't really terms of art in the U.S. And I suggested, why don't we say luxury hotels? And that was accepted. So, I've always treasured those two words in the agreement. My job really was to help the USTR and the administration devise a strategy and implement a strategy for explaining the agreement. Say, here is what is technically in it, and here's what it represents for the variety of things that we, as Americans concerned in one way or another with the China relationship, care about. So we had to do a good job of saying, here are the market access features of it, here are the services features of it, here's trading rights and whatnot. Then you'd expect a kind of response from people who are more pessimistic about the China relationship, saying this is a relationship that is, as I think Jenny was saying, is destined for a confrontation of some sort. Or people who are very intensely critical of the Chinese government and would say this is fine with some other government, but not a Communist Party government. And you have to explain sort of respectfully, here's why we don't agree with those points of view. And here's why we think the agreement will help in the concerns that you have in mind. And so that was the big thing I had to do, was to find a way of helping to present the administration's argument to Congress and to the public as Congress was preparing to vote on the permanent normal trade relations in 2000.
And what would you say in terms of retrospectively looking back, in terms of China's entry into the WTO? Is it the success that the United States government wanted to be, that the Chinese wanted it to be? What marks would you give it?
Well, it's an interesting question. I ask myself this fairly often. I would say one hope was that the agreement would turn China into a major importer and a driver of growth for the U.S., but also worldwide. When that agreement went into effect, China was importing about $250 billion worth of goods annually, and now it's about 1.7 or 8 trillion. So that definitely happened. And I think the hope for China as a driver of growth internationally has come true, but not so much for the U.S. It's mostly been for South America and Southeast Asia, which are really sending lots and lots of their products to China. We hoped, likewise, that it would make China a somewhat more open society with a larger or greater interaction with foreigners. I think that has come true. Hoped that it would also lead to a strengthening of the rule of law in areas like investment and intellectual property and trading rights. And there I'm not as enthusiastic. I think there's been less advance there and less change in the situation we had 10 or 15 years ago than I would have hoped to see.
Okay. Yes, the back row, Nick.
Thank you. My name is Michael Law. I'm studying public administration and international development at Harvard. My question is addressed to both speakers. I want to know how the American people think about the role played by U.S. in the world, and how does it shape the policy making of U.S. foreign policy, and in particular, what role do they see like the U.S. in terms of economic, as a great economic power and military power, and the rise of China, and how does it shape the policy making of U.S. foreign policy?
Small little question.
Yeah. That's quite a question.
There's two questions.
Yeah. Actually, I don't think the U.S. people on the average, they think very much about the world at all. They think much more about, as frankly I think the Chinese people do when they wake up in the morning, which is what's for breakfast. And much more focused on domestic issues. And I think both national governments in Beijing and the United States are much more focused on domestic issues than they are on foreign relations. That's one point. Having said that, if directly asked about the U.S. role in the world, I think most of the population of this nation takes pride in the U.S. as sort of the leader in human rights concerns and other affairs in that. But again, I think the focus is much more on their own family issues and on domestic issues. As far as the rise of China is concerned, quite apart from that sort of lack of focus on world issues, there are different opinion blocks in this country about the rise of China, some of whom take an alarmist view, and some of whom take a much more historical, matter-of-fact view about China's rise. But again, I don't think it's an item of particular interest every day in the lives of the American people.
Well, I think there's some notes of dissension here. In terms of the public's view of America's role in the world, I definitely agree. I think day to day, people aren't thinking a lot about international affairs. year to year or over the course of their lifetimes, they do take pride in the U.S. role in the world. They think in a lot of the big challenges the world has faced in the last century, the U.S. was by and large on the right side and took risks for what they believe is the good of the country and the good of the world. So I think generally they're quite favorable. In terms of China, I guess 2 points. One is I have a kind of somewhat different view about the public's thoughts about the rise of China. I think this is a topic on a lot of people's minds. And I'll give two anecdotes that sort of illustrate it to me. One is a year or so ago, I hosted a dinner for a senator from one of the southern states. And he was talking and sort of, talking about politics and this and that. And I asked him, what are you hearing at home that we're not picking up in Washington? What do people bring up with you at town meetings and so on? And he said a lot of people asked him about China. What does it mean for China to be growing so fast? What does it mean for the United States? How do you explain it? How should the U.S. respond? The other anecdote is my own experience. I think this was 2 years ago, I went home and found that my elementary school, where I went to first and second and third and fourth grade, had dropped their French language program and picked up a Chinese language instruction program. And those sorts of things say to me that the American public does have its mind on China in some way. That it's not a really negative or unfriendly thing, but they think the rise of China is something important, something that will affect them in their own lives, and especially something that will affect their children's lives to the point where they think it is very valuable for their children to be learning Chinese. Then, in terms of what is their attitude about China, there are a couple of quite good polls done of American public opinion. One most recently, I think it was last August or September by the Pew Research Center, and if anyone's interested, I can give you a link to it. But it asked, how do you feel about China as a country, which was fairly positive. It was something like 51% say is good and 36% didn't have a high opinion of China. So it was roughly comparable to European attitudes and more positive than you would find in some neighboring Asian countries. And it was, then they asked a lot of quite detailed questions about what do you think of the Chinese as people, as individuals? And there, the answers were very interesting because they asked a lot of questions. Do you think they're very nationalistic? Do you think they're generous? Do you think they're honest? Do you think they're hardworking? Do you think they're innovative? And then they asked exactly the same questions. What do you think of yourselves as Americans? And it turned out that Americans viewed Chinese people as more polite, less violent, about equally hardworking, somewhat more nationalistic, somewhat less honest than they viewed Americans. It was a very mixed opinion, and some of it was quite positive. And again, if anyone's interested, I can send you a link, because it really is it's the only such survey I've seen that looks not only at policy, but personal attitudes.
Thank you very much for both panelists. I just graduated from the Yale School Master Program, majoring in International Affairs. My question goes to Dr. Koh, I guess. It's about unconventional security issues. With increased interactions between China and the United States in this globalized and informationalized society, the world, how do you make sure, now Wang Lijun can seek asylum in the Chengdu embassy and Chinese nationals can petition on the White House website, seeking protection and, response from the United States. At the same time, Wang Lijun must have brought a lot of interesting information to the U.S. side, and some Chinese nationals might expose some information about the Chinese government or Chinese society on a White House website. People given President Obama this nickname of the head of the petition office in China. So I'm just wondering, do you think China and the United States have or should establish a mechanism where they can solve cooperatively on the unconventional issues such as cybersecurity or the threat posed by sharing information, some authorized, some unauthorized? Thank you.
Well, I think we're already seeing that. In fact, I'd like to point out to my students that shortly after President Nixon's visit to China in 1972, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency set up a relationship with its Chinese counterpart that I think has been fairly consistent in fighting international drug trafficking almost since that time. More recently, we've seen since December 2008 the counter-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden, conducted separately by China, the United States, and many other nations, but there have been many, many instances of cooperation between Chinese and U.S. warships in countering piracy attacks. Counterterrorism is another area where there's been a significant cooperation between the two nations. The American Bar Association and its Chinese counterpart have a very strong program to exchange lawyers. I think we should send more and more American lawyers to China. So I agree with certainly with the value of what you mentioned, and I think a lot of that is underway already. The most recent one, I suppose, is this whole idea of cyber. And can the two nations get together and politely take each other's secrets while cooperating against somebody else taking them?
We've done the same. Over here. And then next is going to be way in back.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Cole. My name is Wu Zihui from Columbia. I just graduated from their LM program. So you mentioned that there are all these mutual defense agreements signed with Japan, Philippines, Australia. But from a lot of Chinese perspective, this area, Asia Pacific, is still in the backyard of China. And while it is understandable that U.S. might have some traditional allies in the region, but the question is, why can't U.S. just maintain the status quo? Why does it have to step up its relationship or engagement in the Asia Pacific region? Thanks.
Well, the thrust of the administration is what we call rebalancing now. We're not supposed to say pivoting anymore. American officials constantly emphasize that this is not just military. And I think that's true, that the U.S. wants to reemphasize our economic and political and social involvement in East Asia. One of the problems is one of perception, however. You can count ships and airplanes and so forth. It's much more difficult to count, for instance, increased language ability among U.S. embassy personnel in a given country in East Asia, or increased investment by or economic assistance provided by U.S. companies or the U.S. government in East Asia. So the shift, I think, is very real, and it is not just military. One of the perceptions that we often read about has to do with various sovereignty issues in East Asia, particularly the Diaoyu Dais and the island land features. Very few of them are actually islands. Land features in the South China Sea. The United States has never committed, for instance, to the Philippines that our mutual defense treaty includes the bits of land that the Philippines claim in the South China Sea, and Washington has maintained a relatively neutral position on that, while urging all the disputing nations just to resolve their differences peacefully. The situation with Japan, of course, is more complicated, since the U.S. does not take a position on who has sovereignty over the Diaoyu Dais, or the Senkakus, as Tokyo calls them, but rather does note that since Tokyo has administrative control over those land features, that they do come under the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty. If nations in East Asia have interpreted the Washington-announced rebalancing in East Asia as a reason to increase a adversarial relationship with Beijing, that has not been the U.S. intent, I don't believe.
Well, can I add something to that? Those countries, Japan and Korea and Philippines and Vietnam and India, they've been there a long time. They have an acute sense of their own interest in their objectives. And I think they are sensing the idea that China views this area as its backyard and are not positive about that way of thinking. And I think that is one of the reasons that their reaction to that view is one of the reasons the tension has risen in the last few years?
Let me just add, I agree with my colleague, and what are we seeing in Southeast Asia because of concern about what China is doing in the South China Sea and elsewhere, is attempting to seek the United States increased presence or an Indian increased presence or even a Japanese increased presence economically in an attempt to provide some balance towards China's increasing presence economically and politically in the region.
Back, all the way back.
Hello, my name is Zhu Guichang. I'm a visiting scholar to the University of Pittsburgh. My major is international politics. My question goes to Mr. Gresser. And you just mentioned in your speech about the U.S. trade negotiations with the EU. And I attended several seminars about the bilateral trade relations between EU and the U.S. And so for this bilateral FTA, there is one argument, that is the FTA is not intended to promote bilateral trade. Why this said? Because, the bilateral trade has developed very well, and the trade volume is high, and sorry.
What's the point of all this?
And also the trade barriers is very low compared with other trading partners, So their major purposes is, their major aim of this bilateral trade is only, their major purpose is to try to maintain their control of international trade regulations. It's want to maintain their control of international trade rule making. So what do you think about this argument? Thank you.
Okay, well, let me make two observations, or maybe three. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, the American government sees exporting as a way to accelerate the path out of the financial crisis and the long recovery we've had. So they are trying hard to find between the U.S. and the EU. There are quite high trade barriers in agriculture. There are car tariffs and whatnot, and there's a lot to do in that relationship. Second, there is somewhat of a look to the future, in that between the U.S. and most of the U.S., or not most of it, but the biggest chunk of U.S. merchandise trade is with Asia. The biggest chunk of services trade is with Europe. And that sort of trade can grow, I think, very considerably, depending on what the rules are. For example, American hospitals could provide European patients with a lot of long-distance care, if there are good regulations to ensure the quality and availability of telemedicine, those sorts of things. And in general, that's one example. I think the big event of trade in the next 20 years will be that services trade over the internet catches up with manufacturing trade carried on boats. And as the invention of container shipping and the GATT agreements that brought down tariffs made manufacturing equal and then larger than natural resource and ag trade. So the next 20 years will be a decade of services catching up with manufacturing. It is difficult to do that through multilateral agreements right now. And the US and EU, as two extremely advanced economies, do have an opportunity to set precedents and begin thinking through ways to make internet trade as large and as stable and secure as goods trade is now. Finally, the two big initiatives the U.S. has is the U.S.-EU and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I see these largely as responses to the experience that the Bush administration had in the Doha round and that the Obama administration had in the climate change talks at Copenhagen, where U.S. administrations went in very much wanting to reach an agreement, found it not really possible to agree with China and India and Brazil on the terms of a Doha round agreement or the terms of a climate change agreement, and both of those stalemated. And so I think that either semi-consciously or deliberately as a result, for the time being, which is not permanent, but maybe for 4 or 5 years, government has moved the BRIC countries out of the center of trade policy and brought into the center Japan, Canada, Mexico, European Union, the other really big trade partners, because I think they feel the experience with the Doha round has been pretty sobering. That it's quite hard to reach an agreement, and if the U.S. is going to look to trade policy as a big driver of recovery, we have to have willing partners that we can reach an agreement with, and that's the explanation, I think, both of the TPP policy and of the U.S.-EU policy.
Thank you, Professor Bernard and Director Edward. I'm Li Qi from Harvard Kennedy School. So I have a question. I feel it's a very interesting phenomenon last year. In the third presidential debate, both candidate Obama and Romney mentioned China 22 times. And I feel like it's very important for the candidates to appear tough on China or on Chinese issue. And they also mentioned some inaccurate information, such as that China is accused of stealing the US jobs, and made in China is a bad thing. So I would like to know how those candidates' attitude toward China will influence their their election results. Thank you.
Okay, well,
go for it.
All right, the China relationship is, I think, taken very seriously by the U.S. government and by Congress and so forth. Over time, American China policy, I think, has been quite stable. Different administrations of different parties have succeeded one another and, by and large, kept up the formula of American Asian strategy in general, of having these alliances traditionally, having an open market and having an engagement policy with China and trying to make the best of a difficult relationship. They are always aware that there are stresses and flaws in the relationship, and that at its heart and embodied in the communiques are potential sources of conflict, which we don't have with any other major power in the world. And that makes the relationship controversial and makes people interested in bringing up alternatives to our current policy. The pattern has been often that the party out of power runs a very critical campaign, as President Clinton did in 1992, and as I believe Ronald Reagan did in 1980, and as Governor Romney did in the last election. They are raising alternatives, but typically when they take office, they look at the situation and decide it's imperfect, but it's not going to get better if we make a radical change in policy. And I think that will probably remain the case, barring some really big upheaval coming from the Chinese side.
But how do you get the one point that she made is that Americans seem fixated on the fact that China has stolen our jobs. And it's very hard to get people to understand when it's their own job, and they visibly see China rising very quickly and our economic situation not as good as it once was. How do we get them to understand those jobs, if they didn't go to China, they would go elsewhere because we don't want to work for the same wages that our grandparents worked for, and we have, entrenched things, benefits that make labor unions, and it makes it very expensive to make things here, and we don't have that wherewithal anymore. Is there, first of all, am I right in that? And how do we get people to understand that?
Well, I'm not so pessimistic about the U.S. as a manufacturer. The trend has been in the U.S. that production rises but employment falls. That we have been more and more concentrated in medical equipment and satellites and aircraft and so forth. And we have gotten out, as you say, of a lot of the labor-intensive industries, like shoemaking and clothing making and so on. But I think, as long as there's this very large imbalance in U.S.-China trade, and we're selling $100 billion and buying $400 billion, that'll be a source of unhappiness. And it will give the people you met with the U.S. Trade Representative a big agenda to work with to say, here's what we're doing to make this relationship more fair and more balanced. And, I think we went through, as to the future, we went through a similar experience with Japan, really between 1970 and 1990. It took a while to go away, and in a way, it started to fade when Japan became a very big investor here, and a lot of Americans working for Japanese companies. And maybe this Smithfield company is a harbinger or something similar in China.
Okay. Right there, Nick. Third row. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm a student in studying East Asian Studies at Duke University, and my question is towards Dr. Cole about security issues. You just now mentioned, and we have been discussing the U.S. and Japan and China's debate on Pacific area, but how about Central Asia? We know from history that it seems that Central Asia is also a very strategically important area that both Russia and even Eastern Europe, they eye on. And then one of my professors, he suggests that China should go to Central Asia to dominate that place in the first place. So how do you comment on this? Thank you.
Well, of course, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, which was formed primarily by Moscow and Beijing in the late 1990s, has been used as a vehicle by both nations to attempt, in my view, to dominate Central Asia with a particular emphasis on gaining energy reserves from that area. And my observation is that since then, Beijing is doing very well at obtaining energy reserves from Kazakhstan and so forth, other Central Asian nations. I'm not convinced that Moscow has resigned itself to losing all those former Soviet state republics to independence. And I frankly, in a long view, say the next 50 years, I see the Central Asian energy reserves and political independence of those former Soviet states as being issues of contention between Beijing and Moscow. But right now, I think Beijing has the upper hand.
Yes, Kobe.
Thank you. My name is Kobe Liu from Washington Lee School of Law. My question will be directly to Mr. Gresser. So what do you think, in your opinion, what's the countermeasure against China's influence, the increasing influence of Chinese yuan, the Chinese currency, and other currency to maintain the predominance of U.S. dollar in the global trade?
Well, I hope the U.S. government doesn't act on American currency policy in the sense of countermeasures against other currencies or other countries. What we need to do is have a well-managed and growing economy at home, and then there will be confidence in the dollar and we'll do okay. And I think that's the limit of that. If people become interested in using the yuan as an exchange currency, I don't see a problem with that.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Grace Zhou Yue. I'm studying business at the Sloan School in MIT. So this morning we heard that with the limited fiscal resources in the United States, the U.S. needs to rely on its allies to project its global influence. But since last year, we see that with countries like Pakistan, which was America's ally in its fight against terrorism, the relationship has strained tremendously. And also in other countries like Egypt, which is now not an enemy but not an ally either. And also in Libya, which the United States like to think it helped liberate it from the tyranny of Gaddafi, we see the Benghazi debacle. So what do you think contributed to this deteriorating relationship with the allies? And what can the American do to strengthen its relationship again, either from economic or a military angle, especially with those which don't share the similar value sets with America? Thank you.
Well, I'll start by observing that national reconstruction or construction is difficult, if not impossible, by another nation. And people who cite the post-World War II examples of Germany and Japan are not really citing, I think, relevant examples. Because before the destruction inflicted during World War II, both Japan and Germany were going concerns, if you will. They were viable nation states with viable economies and political systems. What we have seen in the Middle East, particularly in the so-called Arab Spring, is nations generally with almost no participatory political system heritage to speak of, generally very weak economies or economies that were dependent only on producing oil, nations with long histories of dictatorships and a lack of participation, or perhaps participation only by small elites. So the U.S., as is the case, I think, with any other nation dealing with Libya or Egypt or any of these other states that are experiencing such difficulties, just face very complex situations in which I think it's too easy to overestimate the ability to influence the domestic development of politics in those nations. So I have no real clear answer to your very excellent question other than that.
I guess from my perspective, those are all examples of the troubles of sort of the greater Middle East. Our alliance relationships are often quite strong in East Asia or with Europe or with Canada and Mexico. The U.S. has a big strategic challenge in the Muslim world. Each of those countries in its own way is an example of it. I think somehow there are lessons it can draw from East Asia and maybe ASEAN in particular, that once a very, very turbulent region with a lot of dissension among countries and a lot of dissension between countries has managed to overcome a lot of historic challenges and to significantly improve government and well-being of the public. So I think there are a lot of success stories that part of the world can draw on, and they're not all in the U.S. relationship, and maybe there is a role for China in this.
Thank you. My name is Mason Sun, and I'm a recent graduate of Princeton University where I majored in international relations. So for my senior thesis, my question is for Mr. Gresser, because my senior thesis I wrote about I made an argument against the so-called two-level game model as being applicable to China's bargaining strategy during the WTO negotiation. And since you were personally involved in the process, I would be curious to know as to whether the perception of China's bargaining strategy as being somewhat unconventional, for the better or for the worse, by the U.S. counterparts triggered an adjustment on their part. So, yeah, that would be my question. Thank you.
I'll have to ask you to explain a bit more. I'm a bit embarrassed. I'm not familiar with the term two-level
Well,
strategy.
basically, the negotiator serves as like a go-between between the international partner and the domestic constituencies, which doesn't always apply to China, obviously. So since that was the case, and therefore China had to oftentimes adopt a fairly different bargaining strategy than their U.S. counterparts, I'm wondering how often the perception of that difference triggered an adjustment on the U.S. counterparts when the negotiation process took place.
Okay, well, I don't know if I'll be able to answer that question very effectively, but I can mention a couple of things about WTO accession agreements and the way and the extent to which the Chinese negotiation is different from other WTO accessions. The WTO was created in 1995. At that time, it had 120 members. There are now 159 members. So 39 countries have gone through this experience that China went through. Invariably, the country applying to join the WTO is in a disadvantageous position because it's not really in a position to demand much from its interlocutors, and it's, whether it's the U.S. or the European Union or any other WTO member, has the right to demand whatever it wants of the acceding country. And the acceding country is usually after at least one thing and often two things. One, they want to be a WTO member because as a WTO member, you have quite a lot of protections and guarantees against arbitrary discrimination and willful protectionist policies that aren't available when you're not in the WTO. And this is probably especially true for China because it's such a large and rapidly growing exporter. And you get to be a participant in whatever negotiations WTO is doing, and you get to defend your own interests by filing WTO dispute settlement cases against the other members. And in that sense, China is a bigger country than any of the other acceding countries, but it was fundamentally the same. The difference from my perspective was that the China relationship in general is so important to the United States and so controversial, and particularly controversial within Congress. And that put a lot of stress on the American negotiators that really wasn't there in our negotiations with Mongolia or Albania or Georgia or a lot of the other countries that came in. Somewhere in the middle, you could put the negotiations with Vietnam and with Russia. So, the stress on the U.S. negotiators was more from Congress than it was from China. And I think Chinese position was quite comparable to those of a lot of other new members, except that it was much more under the international spotlight than Albania was.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Yixuan from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, studying mechanical engineering. My question is that China is building more aircraft carriers recently. So China's Navy is showing an increasing interest in the Pacific areas. How do you interpret this?
Well, I think that China's, the People's Liberation Army Navy is making a mistake in building aircraft carriers, just as I think the United States Navy is making a mistake in building the next class of aircraft carriers because of the huge cost of those aircraft carriers, especially if, as I suspect Beijing will, they use nuclear power for those carriers. As a former naval officer, I think a far more effective thing to do would be build a ship 1/5 the size of a supercarrier and equip it not with manned aircraft, but with several hundred unmanned air vehicles. Right now, China's single aircraft carrier has much more of a political effect than it does a naval effect, certainly within East Asia. Having said all that, I do think that if China's economy continues to grow and the People's Liberation Army budget continues to increase, that the PLAN will, in fact, be able to build at least 2 more aircraft carriers.
Hi, my name is Jiang Wei, and I come from studied Master of Public Administration at the State University of New York at Binghamton. And so I have a question for Dr. Ko. That as you mentioned, that the Korean peninsula problem is being raised as a very hot issue over the recently, and as you can see from the timeline, that after the transition of the North Korean leadership, there's many things happen, ranging from launching the missiles and also doing the nuclear experiments. So but recently that the Pyongyang sent an envoy to Beijing, which President Xi met with him. So I'm just, and also there is being demonstrated a very positive side that they want to, they are willing to back to the negotiating table. So, and also I'm sure this topic will be a very, one of the major topics that President Xi and President Obama will discuss in California. So I'm just wondering that what do you think that how will this, like the role that China and America could play could shape the better or change the Sino-U.S. relationship, because will they create a more positive collaboration between two in order to solve the North Korean crisis? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's certainly a difficult situation. I think there's a relatively subtle but important difference in the objectives with respect to North Korea or the Korean Peninsula on the part of the United States and China. I think that Beijing does not want to see a nuclear-armed North Korea, but is more concerned with stability on a peninsula. From the U.S. perspective, I think the United States is more concerned with a non-nuclear North Korea than it is with the stability of the North Korean state per se. What I wonder about, given the intransigence of Pyongyang to both international efforts, particularly including China, whether the long-term solution may be a cooperative agreement between Beijing and Seoul, the sort of jointly South Korea, Beijing, fence in North Korea and eventually convince North Korea to give up nuclear weapons and to sort of join the more common world community. And I think that sort of agreement, and of course we already have a very strong economic agreement between South Korea and China, but I think that sort of South Korean-Chinese strategic agreement might well come at the cost of the U.S.-South Korean Mutual Defense Treaty. And from a U.S. perspective, if that meant giving up the Mutual Defense Treaty with South Korea to neutralize North Korea as an international threat, that might not be a bad bargain.
There was a hand up right back there.
Hi, my name is Koyan from SAIS Johns Hopkins. I have a question regarding how United States is going to continue to enforce the security in international community. In modern era, we understand that it's really hard to define terrorism because we can hardly define this term comprehensively. And therefore, however, under the current situation of globalization, there is easy transforming of resources and human mobility and everything transnational, internationally. And then under this situation, there's happened issue of cross-border bomb between Canada and United States right now. And I wonder how the United States foreign policy will be changed in this domestic threats of the national security and international security.
Clearly, all the organized nations of the world have a concern about terrorism. Terrorism is never going to be eradicated because it's simply a tactic. It's not even a strategy, let alone a state-to-state threat, if you will. And it's clearly an area where there's already a good deal of international communication and cooperation. And it's a curious situation in that the globalization you mentioned makes terrorism easier to conduct, if you will, or to commit. But hopefully it also lends the nation states of the world better tools to combat terrorism. And I think this is an area where we will see continued cooperation, certainly between China and the United States, as well as among other nations of the world.
I think right in front, first row.
Hi, my name is Zahao. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon studying structural health monitoring. My question is, there's a regular basis interaction between the U.S. military and the Chinese military, which is U.S. military would send aircrafts over to the area that are very close to the territory of China, and then Chinese military would respond to send aircraft up there to drive them away. This interaction also caused serious consequences in the past. But I also heard another description that when the pilots up there, they say hello to each other, smile at each other, and then go back to their own bases. So how do you describe this kind of interaction between the two sides? Thank you.
Of course, the strategic difference or the national difference between Washington and Beijing has to do with each nation's interpretation of the rights of the host nation for the exclusive economic zone. You know, when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was formulated, China signed it and ratified it. The United States has signed it, but the Senate has not ratified it. Although every American president since President Ronald Reagan has said that the U.S. will adhere to all the parameters that are spelled out in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States position is that we can conduct, it's perfectly legal, and according to UNCLOS and according to the treaty, to conduct military surveillance operations within the exclusive economic zone of another nation, as we do with many nations of the world, not just China. Beijing's position, and it's a position that India, for instance, and Brazil both agree with, as well as some other nations. China's position is that it is not in accordance with the United Nations Treaty to conduct surveillance operations within its exclusive economic zone. So it has, over the course of the years, as do other nations, sent up aircraft to intercept and escort the United States surveillance aircraft. What happened in 2001, of course, is that the Chinese fighter pilot simply got too close to the United States surveillance aircraft, and there was a collision. Unfortunately, the Chinese pilot lost his life, and the American aircraft had to make a forced landing on Hainan. As far as the pilots waving each other, I think this is pretty common among airmen, just as at sea, when Chinese and U.S. warships come into close proximity, it's generally a friendly exchange of hellos, if you will.
Okay, way in the back, there's a question.
Thank you. My name is Hui Zhao. I'm a visiting researcher at the Center for Latin American Studies of the Georgetown University. My question goes for both, and it's regarding about the weight of the security issues and economic issues in the agenda of the U.S.-China relationship. In the recent years, I think that the security issues such as the cyber attack and the South China Sea disputes have gained more weight in the agenda, more than the economy issues. So I wonder, could you explain what the main reason behind the shift? And will it make the China-U.S. relationship more fragile, or will it contribute to make a more conducive and trusting relationship between the two countries? Thank you.
Want to kick it off? This is a very interesting question and a very difficult one to answer. I'll note that before 1914, before World War I started, there were some very significant books written to the point that because the nations of the world were now so, particularly between the New World and Europe, were so now economically linked that the chances of nation-to-nation large-scale conflict no longer existed. Obviously, that was an erroneous interpretation of the economic versus the national security environment of the time. Today, we can look at the interaction between the U.S. and the Chinese economy, certainly very complex and interdependent to a large degree. And yet, there are always going to be issues that each nation determines are a vital national security concern that I think in the final analysis would outweigh economic relationships. Earlier, I mentioned the area of the Shanghai, the three Cs, or as opposed to the U.S. mutual defense treaties. And I think this is the area that needs to be of most concern between China and the U.S., both as areas of potential security conflict, but also areas of economic interest, both conflictual and cooperative.
I guess from my perspective, actually two things. There was a influential article or essay published last year by the Brookings Institution, which is a dialogue between two eminent scholars of Sino-American relations, one an American guy named Kenneth Lieberthal, and the other a Chinese academic named Wang Zhisi. And it was quite pessimistic. And both of them were looking at a phenomenon they called strategic distrust, which was, in their view, a diminishing sense of common interest and rising suspicion between the two governments over the behavior of the other. And they had many explanations for why this was, but relatively few ideas about what could be done about it. And in that sort of situation, security issues and problems will tend to become more salient, more prominent, and harder to resolve. On the other hand, it seems to me also that as the relationship has frayed a bit over the years at the higher levels, it has become broader and stronger at a people-to-people level. That you are now among, I think, 200,000 Chinese who are studying in the U.S. And I don't think every Chinese student who's coming here is making some sort of informed decision that maybe there are problems in the relationship, but they can probably be managed, and the United States is in one way or another part of the future of the young generation of Chinese. And when I look at the relationship and I see these two different trends, I sort of wonder, which, should you be guided by the worries and fears of scholars and high officials, or by the more apparent confidence of very intelligent young people who are planning out their futures and sort of betting on a positive track? And that's really one of the key questions to me, and one I don't quite know how to answer.
Okay, we've come to the end of this session. We want to thank Mr. Gresser and Captain Cole for giving us a very interesting overview. Xiaopeng has an announcement to make, and then we'll give you some instructions for what's going to happen next.